There is a space marine standing in the middle of the Imperial Armour records, who no Administratum scribe has been able to fully account for. He is taller than his own honor guard, not by implication, not by camera angle, but by a full head of height over warriors who are already sealed inside Tactical Dreadnought Armour. That armor adds hundreds of kilograms of ceramite and adamantium bulk to whoever is wearing it, transforming a 7-foot space marine into something significantly more imposing than that. He is still taller. Dozens of brass bonding studs are hammered across his slab plates in patterns that echo Heresy-era construction without belonging cleanly to any single recognized configuration, so dense that the servo bundles beneath them thrum audibly just to keep him moving. The weapons built into his gauntlets don't have a clean classification. Each one fuses a power fist, a lightning claw, and a chainfist blade into a single hybrid instrument named Hunger and Slake, respectively. Because naming your weapons after the sensations preceding and following consumption is apparently the appropriate register when you command a chapter called the Space Sharks. When a Techmarine has attempted to catalog the parent pattern of this suit, the answer has come back the same way every time. Tactical Dreadnought pattern. Heavily modified. To what degree and toward what original configuration, the records don't specify. His name is Tyberos the Red Wake. He is the Shade Lord of the Carcharodons Astra, the Carcharodons' own designation for the role Imperial Convention calls Chapter Master, one of dozens of signals that this chapter has been operating by its own internal language for long enough that standard terminology feels foreign in it. Tyberos first appeared in the written record in Imperial Armour Volume 10 in 2010, introduced under the designation Baleful First Captain Tyberon. That name didn't follow him through subsequent material. The Red Wake did. In Robbie McNiven's 2018 novel Carcharodons Outer Dark, he kills 3 Tyranid warriors in seconds before clearing a boarding pod, described throughout the sequence as moving almost too fast for the eye to see, in the same text that consistently identifies him as a giant. Fan calculations based on his description as standing a full head taller than already armored Terminator honor guard put him at approximately 9 feet. His face, in the rare instances when the novel describes it directly, is a corpse-white nightmare with half the bones of the face exposed. He is, across the sum of his documentation, the physical maximum of what the setting seems willing to build and still call a space marine rather than something else. His suit throbbed with the vast power necessary to keep its thick servo bundles active, which is a detail worth sitting with. Standard Terminator armor is described in terms of its weight, its ceramite shell, its adamantium subframe, the integrated life support systems, the power cabling threaded through its structure. Tyberos' armor required a generation beyond that. The servos that keep his limbs operational against the suit's own mass are running harder than the engineering was originally intended to handle. The armor wasn't designed for him. It was modified for him, extensively, to the point where the original configuration is now more architectural archaeology than live record. The brass bonding studs across the slab plates are the most visible evidence of this. Each one a fastening point where the modification required structural reinforcement that the original pattern had not anticipated, hammered in place by Techmarines who presumably had the theological flexibility to prioritize functionality over aesthetic purity. Hunger and Slake are worth describing individually because calling them lightning claws, the community shorthand, understates what they are. Each weapon combines 3 separate armament classifications into a single hybrid instrument. A power fist for raw crushing force, a lightning claw for the directed energy discharge and penetration, and a chain fist blade for structural cutting through materials that the other 2 components can't defeat cleanly. This isn't a lightning claw. This is a weapon built for a specific warrior with specific requirements and a naming philosophy that categorizes his instruments as extensions of a cosmological appetite rather than pieces of equipment. 3 Tyranid warriors in seconds, moving too fast to track. approximately 9 feet of corpse-white warrior in unclassifiable, brass-studded armor, carrying weaponry so specialized it needs 3 separate designations per hand. The title Red Wake refers to the speed and ferocity of his close combat performance, the trail left behind him when he has moved through an enemy formation too quickly for them to register it as anything other than aftermath. There is an open question about where Tyberos stands in the era of Primaris Space Marines. Firstborn Marines stand around 7 feet. Primaris Marines stand closer to 8. A deliberate biological escalation in the Ultima founding that brought the standard Space Marine profile upward by a measurable margin. The question is whether that upward scaling closes the gap between Tyberos and a standard Terminator warrior, or whether his dimensions always existed far enough outside the normal distribution that a 14% increase in the baseline does not meaningfully affect the comparison. No canonical post-Primaris size comparison for Tyberos has been published. The answer awaits a scene that does not yet exist in the written record, and the argument over what that answer will be continues across the breadth of 40K discussion with the specific intensity that unresolved canonical questions reliably produce. To understand Tyberos as more than an exceptionally large warrior in an exceptionally modified suit, you have to understand what he commands. The Carcharodons Astra are fleet-based. No homeworld, no fixed planetary installation, no permanent segmentum garrison, no recoverable record of a permanent presence anywhere in settled Imperial space. Their operational doctrine is called nomad predation, a disciplined drift through the outer darkness of Imperial space, operating in regions where the Imperium maintains no formal military presence, hunting threats before those threats reach the populated sectors inward of their patrol range. In practice, this means the Carcharodons have been operating in the void for so long and at such distance from standard Imperial resupply and communication networks that they have become, through decades of cumulative operational isolation, something that reads more like a force of nature encountered in deep space than a chapter of His Divine Majesty's Space Marines with a verified founding charter and a documented chain of command. Their warriors are gray-clad and white-faced, with eyes described in primary sources as black as the outer dark. They fight in utter silence. No war cries, no spoken coordination, no vocalized challenge. When they board an enemy vessel, what the enemy encounters first isn't noise, but gray armored shapes moving through corridors without sound, which in the specific acoustic environment of a void ship engagement, the background hiss of life support, the distant structural stress of hull breach, the near silence of a corridor where no one has spoken yet, is a more immediately destabilizing experience than shouted threats. The silence isn't a tactical accident, it's cultural, practiced, a chapter-wide commitment to a psychological effect they have refined over an operational history that is, by the physical evidence aboard their warships, extremely long. That physical evidence is Contemptor dreadnoughts aboard their warships. Heresy-era hardware, which means this chapter has been operational since approximately the 31st millennium, or has been resupplying from sources with access to 31st millennium technology, neither of which is a casual institutional detail. The Contemptor dreadnought was a Horus Heresy-era chassis. The Imperium of the 41st millennium does not manufacture new ones. Finding them aboard company vessels suggests a chapter whose oldest war materials aren't ceremonially ancient, but documentably, operationally ancient. At the Badab War in the 41st millennium, the Carcharodons arrived without warning. No coordination with existing coalition forces, no communication to the battle fleet, no announcement. Both loyalist and secessionist contingents registered alarm at their appearance, which requires context to appreciate fully, because these were already Space Marine formations actively engaged in shooting at each other, which isn't a baseline from which most things register as additionally alarming. Commander Carib Colon of the Red Scorpions documented what the records describe as misgivings about their presence, then assigned them to critical operations because the Carcharodons were devastatingly effective and the Badab campaign had no room for principals to indulge their misgivings. This is the Carcharodons' consistent relationship with every Imperial force that has encountered them. They unsettle their allies almost as automatically as they destroy their enemies. They operate with a level of autonomy that generates documented concern about their loyalty among forces nominally fighting alongside them, and they remain useful enough that the concern is consistently set aside in favor of deploying them against the next objective. Their origin sits in deliberate ambiguity. The canonical position is that the Carcharodons are an alleged successor chapter of the Raven Guard, with each word of that construction chosen to preserve what the records can't resolve, rather than overstate what they can. Community analysis has constructed a timeline linking them to the Pale Nomads, a pre-heresy force of exiled Terran-born space marines under a Shade Lord named Arcus Fall, potentially founded before the Raven Guard's formal establishment under Corvus Corax. The title Shade Lord, the Carcharodons' designation for their chapter master, the same title Tyberos carries, appears in this pre-heresy record alongside figures who would later be associated with the Raven Guard's founding trauma. Corax is said to have found the Terran-born members of his legion's warrior culture too brutal, and those members were reportedly exiled rather than integrated. The Carcharodons' connection to the Ashen Claws, a Raven Guard successor formation that abandoned the Imperium before the heresy, exists in documented Lexicanum records and adds another thread to this weave without resolving it. There is also a strand of analysis connecting the Carcharodons to the Night Lords, based partly on the shared Shade Lord title and partly on the assessment found in the Red Tithe novel material that the Carcharodons fight with a psychological ferocity that resembles the 8th Legion's operational doctrine. This strand hasn't achieved canonical confirmation. The origin is officially unresolved, and the ambiguity appears to be maintained intentionally, a chapter whose founding is as unknowable as its current operating location, commanded by a Shade Lord in an unclassifiable suit, drifting through the dark in warships with Heresy-era dreadnoughts in the holds, and a cultural identity old enough that its origin can only be theorized. Tyberos commands this. He isn't a chapter master who happens to be large. He is the focal point of a chapter whose institutional history is as deliberately impenetrable as his armor pattern. Terminator armor wasn't born in conditions of careful development. The major Heresy-era patterns were engineered for warriors who needed to force entry into fortified positions, absorb dedicated anti-armor fire, and survive close-quarters engagements that would destroy anything lighter. The ceramite plasteel composite shell over an adamantium subframe, the integrated life support running independently of external conditions, the powered exoskeleton capable of amplifying the already superhuman strength of a space marine to something closer to a walking siege engine. All of it represents the absolute outer edge of what human manufacturing could produce for individual infantry. It worked. The armor worked. It kept warriors alive in conditions that should have killed them, and delivered them to objectives that lighter forces couldn't reach. The formations that became legendary in Tactical Dreadnought Armour didn't become legendary because of the manufacturing. The World Eaters had a problem with the Butcher's nails, and the problem wasn't their failure. The problem was their success. The nails were cybernetic cranial implants. The documentation calls them psychosurgery, which is a precise term for an imprecise intervention, developed and deployed across the 12th Legion under Angron's influence. Their mechanism was straightforward and brutal in equal measure. They generated pain during inactivity and suppressed it during combat, which created an immediate positive feedback loop driving the implanted warrior toward violent engagement. In the early deployment phases, a World Eater carrying the nails was a ferocious and extraordinarily effective combatant who could manage the feedback between engagements, who could stand down after battle, attend to logistics and planning, and the organizational functions a legion requires, and then return to combat when needed. The nails sharpened a World Eater and placed the sharpened edge at combat service. This was the intended function. The nails didn't maintain a stable relationship with time. The longer they ran, the deeper they integrated with the neural architecture they were operating alongside, and the more the threshold between combat active and everything else eroded. Warriors who had carried the nails for years found the management window shortening. The gap between engagement and non-engagement became harder to navigate, then harder still. The nails weren't designed with a mechanism for distinguishing between authorized enemy combatants and personnel standing nearby. They were designed to generate the neurochemical conditions of combat, and they did that with increasing thoroughness until the distinction between enemy and ally ceased to register as meaningfully different. By the Istvan campaign, the sequence of events surrounding the drop site massacre of Istvan V, a cohort of World Eater's warriors had passed through this threshold entirely. Reason was no longer accessible to them in any functional sense. The nails had run too deep, too long. The 12th Legion organized them. The Red Butchers were sealed into cataphracti-patterned Terminator armor and armed with twin power axes. Their squad leaders, those who had somehow retained sufficient cognitive distinction from the others to be differentiated, to be recognized as the dominant consciousness in a squad of warriors who had abandoned consciousness as a functional state, were given the title the Devoured. Between deployments, these warriors were hung in chains in the holds of World Eater's warships, foaming and screaming in impotent rage, suspended in their Terminator frames, unable to move, unable to reach anything, unable to discharge the neurological pressure the nails were generating continuously. The warships carried them in this state for however long the next engagement required. When they were needed, they were transported to the deployment point still in their chains. At the appropriate tactical moment, the chains were unlocked. They were pointed at the enemy position. The Butcher's nails had removed the ability to distinguish between authorized targets and Imperial allies in the immediate vicinity. The suit addressed this limitation in the only way a suit can address a neurological failure, by physically constraining the wearer between deployments and providing enough structural mass that the warriors directly adjacent to a Red Butcher during the brief window between unlocking and contact with the enemy had a marginally improved chance of surviving the transition. The chains were one cage. The cataphractii plate was the other. The cataphractii is the heaviest, most densely protected Heresy-era Terminator pattern. Broad pauldrons built to deflect dedicated anti-armor fire, a material configuration so dense it approaches an invulnerable quality that standard weapons can't reliably penetrate. On a conventional Terminator formation, this protection maximized the warrior's survivability during the approach to a hardened position. On a Red Butcher, it served that function and simultaneously served as the containment infrastructure that kept the formation marginally safe to operate near. Their first major deployment was the Istvan campaign. Their performance was documented as brutally effective and bloodthirsty, which is an assessment made against the baseline that World Eater's warriors were already among the most aggressively violent operational profiles in the Legionis Astartes, a baseline that required separate documentation to note as exceeded. The Red Butchers exceeded it distinctly enough that exceeding it required recording. They weren't warriors who had been damaged by the nails and were being deployed in spite of that damage. They were warriors who had been transformed by the nails into something the 12th Legion recognized as a specific weapons system with a specific deployment doctrine. Transport in chains, deliver to contact point, release, document results. The cataphractii armor is the purest single-pattern expression of the script's central argument. It didn't create the terror. The nails created the terror. The cataphractii made the terror survivable long enough to be delivered to the correct target. Take the cataphractii away, and you have uncontrollable warriors who can't be transported, deployed, or directed. Take the nails away, and you have exceptional cataphractii armored infantry who can be reasoned with. Both components are necessary, but only one of them is the point. The Death Shroud moved in the opposite direction. Where the Red Butchers were warriors who had lost the ability to choose, the Death Shroud were warriors who chose to remove choice from the equation entirely. To be elevated to Mortarian's personal bodyguard was to accept a condition that no other formation in the Death Guard, or in any other legion's record, formally required: the surrender of identity. Not the suppression of it, not the subordination of it to Legion duty as all Space Marines accepted. The full surrender. Names given up, personal histories relinquished. The accumulated record of who you had been before the appointment, every engagement, every title, every personal distinction earned through decades of service, discontinued upon induction. What remained was function. Mortarion moved through the heresy, surrounded at all times by an inner perimeter, and within that perimeter the Death Shroud maintained position. Their weapon was the Man Reaper, massive sides built to the scale required by warriors in full Terminator armor, designed to intercept anything crossing that perimeter with lethal force before it reached the Primarch's body. Warriors in highly artificed Terminator plate, quality above standard Death Guard issue, constructed to give them a tall, barrel-chested silhouette distinctly readable against the rest of the Death Guard's profile, maintaining a perimeter that nothing was authorized to cross without consequences that the Man Reapers made immediate and final. The artifice nature of their armor deserves attention. Standard Legion Terminator plate was already exceptional. The Death Shroud's suits were built beyond that standard. Specifics of what highly artificed means in this context aren't fully detailed in the surviving record, but the designation indicates construction at the level of named relics rather than standard issue equipment. Warriors who had given up their names were wearing armor that the 14th Legion had invested its finest available craftsmanship in producing. The anonymity wasn't an indicator of low status. It was the condition of the highest status the Death Guard recognized in a bodyguard appointment. They rarely spoke. When they did, the sources record their voices emerging as a rattling hiss, which in the context of warriors who have been in Terminator plate long enough for their physiology to adapt partially to its environmental conditions, suggests a quality of voice that had moved some distance from the range a baseline human would recognize as natural. The silence wasn't imposed on them. It was maintained as a deliberate operational condition, broken only to transmit Mortarion's commands to forces outside the Primarch's immediate hearing range. In practice, the Death Shroud moved through the Death Guard's campaigns as a perimeter of silence surrounding a Primarch whose own affect ran cold and methodical. An inner ring of nameless warriors in superior armor, carrying oversized sides and communicating nothing about their individual existence because their individual existence had been formally dissolved upon appointment. The inversion this creates within the framework of feared formations is real and it's structural. Almost every other elite Terminator unit in this record builds its legend through personal mythology. Specific warriors accumulate names, titles, engagements associated with their individual history. The Red Wake, the Devoured, the Black Armored First Captain. Terror grows from the specific gravity of specific people, from the weight of documented action attributed to a known identity. The Death Shroud demolished this mechanism by design. Warriors who shared no distinguishable identity, who couldn't be addressed individually, who had no name to negotiate with, and no personal history to appeal to. A warrior with no name can't be approached as an individual, which means every conventional tactic for managing a dangerous person, direct address, acknowledgement of status, implied recognition of their specific history, is unavailable. There is nothing to appeal to. The sides are there, and the perimeter is the perimeter, and the armor is excellent, and the voice, if it comes at all, is a rattling hiss. Mortarion led the Death Guard into Nurgle's service during the Heresy's later stages. The Death Shroud followed him. Their role didn't change. The sides were still there. The silence was still there. Whatever names the Death Shroud carried before their appointment aren't questions the canon has chosen to answer, and given the appointment conditions, this seems appropriate. The Sons of Horus built their finest warriors as an announcement. The Justaerin were the foremost Terminator subformation of the 16th Legion's first company, one of two distinct subformations within an elite company that was itself the Legion's defining statement about what excellence looked like when organized at scale. Their armor was black. The Sons of Horus were sea green. In the visual vocabulary of a legion that flew the eye of Horus across campaigns spanning the galaxy, whose Primarch was the war master of the entire rebellion, and whose favor carried consequences that other Legion commanders spent active political energy pursuing. In this environment, wearing black wasn't a personal aesthetic choice by a formation that happened to prefer a different color. It was a designation. The black plate communicated, to anyone who had any familiarity with the 16th Legion, exactly what category of warrior had just entered the operational space. They were early proponents of tactical dreadnought armor within the Sons of Horus. Records confirm their early adoption, meaning they had committed to the armor's protection versus mobility calculus and integrated it into their formation doctrine before most of the Heresy's key engagements had established how that calculus would play out. Their tactical function was the decapitation strike. The Lexicanum records their purpose as destroying the heart of an opposing target or conducting a decapitation strike on an enemy force. They were, in the Legion's own framing, the point of the spear, the foremost element of the foremost Legion, directed at command structures and critical nodes, assigned to engagements where the objective wasn't to defeat a defense, but to remove the command structure sustaining it. In Horus Rising, Dan Abnett's opening novel of the Horus Heresy series, the document that established the visual and tonal language of the entire sequence, the Justaerin appear as dark figures of First Company's foremost Terminator squad. The framing prioritizes their visual presence before their tactical specifications, because their tactical specifications were understood by everyone present in any engagement where the Justaerin had arrived. What needed to be communicated first was their weight in a room. The black plate accomplished that. Many Justaerin entered combat explicitly in Terminator configuration rather than standard power armor, because the armor's resilience allowed them to close with defensive positions that would have stopped lighter troops before the objective was within reach. A decapitation strike against a fortified command element requires the strike force to survive long enough to reach the command element, and the black-armored First Company had built their entire operational doctrine around the assumption that Terminator protection was the prerequisite for everything else they did. The Legion's first captain, Ezekiel Abaddon, eventually led the Justaerin in the Heresy's later campaigns, which added a specific resonance to the formation's identity. Abaddon was the Sons of Horus's most visible subordinate commander, the figure the Legion's internal hierarchy placed directly beneath the War Master, and his leadership of the black-armored First Company meant the Justaerin were simultaneously the tactical elite and the political center of the 16th Legion below Horus himself. Galaxy in Flames confirms the Justaerin in direct action. The Justaerin warriors, the Sons of Horus First Company Terminators, in the early Heresy's pivotal engagements, present at the moments the rebellion's early shape was being decided. They were the finest warriors in service to the losing side of the Horus Heresy. That their excellence was real does not change what their excellence was deployed in service of. The Black Plate and the decapitation strikes and the point of the spear doctrine all survived the Heresy's outcome in the sense that Abaddon survived it, carrying into the 41st millennium the accumulated operational identity of the 16th Legion's most elite formation toward objectives the subsequent 10,000 years would make familiar. The 8th Legion built its doctrine around something most legions treated as a side effect. Fear wasn't, for the Night Lords, the psychological byproduct of effective combat operations. It was the primary weapon, cultivated before the first shot was fired, calibrated across planetary populations who were shown what the Night Lords were capable of, and then left alive to communicate that capability to the next target. The sequence was deliberate: demonstration, survival of witnesses, propagation of the account, degraded resistance at the next target before the Night Lords arrived. By the time Night Lords Terminators of the Atramentar entered an engagement, the enemy had already been partially defeated by what the enemy knew was coming. The first captain who commanded the Atramentar, the elite Terminators of the Night Lords' First Company, was Jago Sevatarian, Sevatar. His self-description is recorded in the Fandom Wiki's opening attributed quote, "I am a son of the sunless world, and 8th Legion to my core." This is a statement of identity delivered without qualification or apology, and it matches every documented aspect of his command conduct. He was genuinely, functionally committed to what the Night Lords were, which was, in his own recorded assessment, something specific. The Space Wolves had constructed a mythology of hunters, of warriors who killed with purpose and selectivity in the manner of noble predators. Sevatar's characterization of the comparison was direct. The wolves were warriors before they became soldiers. We were murderers first, last, and always. The Night Lords had not evolved from some earlier, nobler mode of operation into their current doctrine. They had been murderers from the beginning, had understood this about themselves from the beginning, and had organized their entire legion around the systematic use of murder as an instrument of compliance. He didn't consider this a shameful admission requiring apology or euphemism. He considered it precision. The Atramentar operated as the distilled form of this doctrine in close-quarters battle. 8th Legion Terminators entering an engagement represented a specific escalation in the Night Lord's operational calculus. Their presence meant the target had been assessed as requiring the Legion's most capable warriors, which meant the psychological preparation for that target had been correspondingly intensive. The fear apparatus wasn't softened by the elite status of the formation deploying it. The Atramentar in Night Lord's Terminator plate were, by the doctrine of their legion, the final delivery mechanism for a weapon that had been deployed weeks before the engagement began. Sevatar's relationship with Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter, was one of the Heresy's stranger Primarch First Captain dynamics, in a period that produced several unusual specimens of that relationship. He challenged Kurz directly in documented exchanges, calling out the contradictions in the Night Haunter's self-justifications with a specificity that most of Kurz's legion didn't attempt. The Black Library record has him saying directly, "How can you lie to me like this? How can you lie to yourself?" Addressing a Primarch whose psychological instability was among the Heresy's best documented Legion command problems. In a Legion not known for cultivating the kind of command culture where first captains corrected their Primarch's reasoning. That Sevatar survived long enough to accumulate the legend he did suggests either exceptional courage in the exchange or an exceptionally accurate read of exactly how far Conrad Kurz's tolerance for a useful first captain extended. What happened to Sevatar and the Atramentar after the Night Haunter's eventual assassination by a Calidus Temple operative, after the Night Lord's fragmentation into independent warbands operating without Legion coherence? This is one of the genuinely unresolved threads in 8th Legion history. The Night Lords scattered. The records of the Atramentar after Kurz's death don't resolve cleanly in the available documentation. What persists is the shape of a first captain who was, by his own direct account, a murderer who knew it, commanding the elite Terminators of a legion of murderers who had known it from the beginning, and who considered honesty about this not a confession, but a simple description of operational reality. The Night Lord's doctrine required that the enemy know what was coming. Sevatar extended this principle to include his own Primarch, which is either the most Night Lord's thing he could have done, or the most dangerous, and in his case appears to have been both simultaneously. The Tartaros pattern has a confirmed mechanical distinction from the cataphractii. It supports greater battlefield mobility, including the sweeping advance capability that brings its wearer's movement profile closer to standard power armor than to the stationary fortress dynamic of a fully committed cataphractii configuration. The cataphractii trades that mobility for maximum durability, a denser, heavier configuration whose invulnerable quality derives from material mass and sophisticated protective field generation, rather than from any movement-based defensive system. Both patterns saw deployment across multiple legions throughout the Heresy, and they attracted warriors with genuinely different operational requirements. A warrior who needed to close distance rapidly, or pursue a routing enemy, or maintain position in a fluid engagement, that warrior reached for the Tartaros. A warrior who needed to hold a breach, absorb a coordinated assault, or advance directly through concentrated defensive fire while remaining functional, that warrior reached for the cataphractii. The visual language the Tartaros produced is distinctly different from the cataphracti's architectural vocabulary. The cataphracti reads immediately as a fortification. Those broad pauldrons, the deliberate visual weight of something that has decided immovability, is itself a tactical virtue. The sense that it has taken a position and intends to remain there regardless of what is brought against it. The Tartaros carries a slimmer, more articulated profile. It communicates mass and mobility simultaneously, a design that resolves the apparent contradiction between Terminator-class protection and the ability to move through a changing battlefield. Warriors in Tartaros plate could run in a way warriors in Cataphractii plate couldn't, and this capability informed how they were deployed, how they thought about their role in an engagement, and ultimately, how their armor became associated with a particular philosophy of what Terminator warfare should look like. The Tartaros isn't a lesser version of the Cataphractii. It's a different answer to the same question. And the answer it gives has produced, across the breadth of the hobby and the community surrounding it, one of the more intense expressions of faction-specific affection that a piece of equipment design has generated. There is something about the Tartaros that produces possessiveness in people who study it carefully enough. The armor does not belong to them. The feeling persists anyway. The Saturnine pattern has the strangest origin story of any Heresy-era Terminator armor configuration. The Cataphractii and Tartaros trace their development lineages to Terra and Mars, to the primary centers of the Imperium's technological development, the sites of the most concentrated mechanicum expertise, the environments where competing Heresy-era designs were tested against each other, and the strongest patterns survived. The Saturnine pattern wasn't developed there. It was developed on the ninth moon of Saturn by a subsect of the mechanicum that had been exiled. Warhammer Community's official documentation confirms it, banished from the main Martian development environment, sent to a Saturnian moon specifically to remove them from the collaborative peer review structures through which mechanicum technology was standardized, assessed, and either incorporated into the mainstream or rejected. Working in isolation, on a moon of Saturn, without access to the principal mechanicum design community or its accumulated institutional knowledge, this subsect built a Terminator armor pattern. The result carries the marks of its development conditions visibly and specifically. The Saturnine has an angular quality, an architectural language that does not share the visual grammar of the patterns developed in contact with the mainstream mechanicum tradition. Evaluate a Cataphractii and a Tartaros alongside each other, and you are looking at two answers from the same design conversation, proceeding from shared assumptions and shared aesthetic references toward different tactical conclusions. Evaluate a Saturnine alongside either of them, and you are looking at what happened when a group of mechanicum adepts ran similar design principles through an interpretive framework that had been developing in isolation for long enough to diverge. Not wrongly, not in a way that produced inferior results, but differently enough that the divergence is visible in every surface and joint angle of the finished product. The exile is legible in the design. The isolation produced something that couldn't have been produced in the mainstream development environment, because the mainstream development environment would have normalized it before it finished. The Dreadwing formation of the First Legion used it. This deserves to be stated plainly, because the Naufragia, the Terminator units of the Dreadwing, clad in Phoebian-issue Saturnine Terminator armor, are confirmed in Lexicanum records and represent a specific and significant deployment decision. The Dreadwing wasn't the Dark Angel's standard line formation. The Dreadwing was the formation the First Legion maintained for its most absolute operational requirements. The capabilities reserved for engagements where the Dark Angels had determined that a target needed to be removed rather than defeated. The conventional military outcomes were insufficient. That the tools of final resort were the correct tools for this particular situation. The formations operating under Dreadwing authorization carried weapons and doctrines that the First Legion didn't deploy casually or across the full range of its campaigns. The Naufragia were the Terminator element within this structure. The First Legion chose Saturnine armor for the Terminator warriors of its most extreme formation. This wasn't a casual equipment selection. The Dreadwing's choices reflected deliberate calculation about what was required for the work the formation existed to do. A pattern developed in Mechanicum Exile, angularly different from its contemporaries in ways that the mainstream Mechanicum tradition might have smoothed away if it had been produced in contact with that tradition. This was the pattern the Naufragia wore into the engagements that the Dark Angels doctrine classified as requiring everything the First Legion had. The Saturnine earned that context. The exile-born angular pattern that looks different because it was designed differently, by people who were sent away specifically to prevent them from making things the conventional way. It delivered in the most demanding context the First Legion could assign. For the record, offered as positive information rather than a correction to any particular account. The Imperial Fists documented Terminator innovation through the Huskarls formation, and the documentation is specific. The Huskarls were the Terminator retinue assigned to senior 7th Legion officers, a formally designated unit with a defined weapons configuration in Horus Heresy records, the Solarite Power Gauntlet. Huskarls were equipped with these gauntlets, a specialized power weapon representing a deliberate departure from the standard Terminator loadout options towards something specifically calibrated for the Imperial Fist's tactical identity. The Huskarls existed as a named formation. The Solarite Power Gauntlet is specified as their designated armament in official records, and both appear in Horus Heresy rules references for the new edition. Any account of the 7th Legion's relationship with Terminator doctrine that omits the Huskarls and the Solarite Power Gauntlet is working from an incomplete record. The Indomitus pattern is the most widespread Terminator armor configuration in the Imperium as of the 41st millennium. It equips Terminator squads across dozens of chapters, from the Ultramarines to formations whose names only appear in secondary indexes and regimental records. It's functional, proven, and logistically dominant in a way that none of the specialized Heresy-era patterns, the Cataphractii, the Tartaros, the Saturnine, can match simply because none of them were ever produced at the volume the Indomitus achieved across the subsequent 10,000 years. By any measure of operational footprint and distribution, Indomitus is the answer to the question, what does a Terminator wear? None of the formations in this account wear it. The gap is the point. The most widely deployed armor pattern in the Imperium hasn't produced the legends. It has equipped the bulk of the warriors who hold the line, and the line wouldn't exist without them. But the warriors who became the stories, the ones who earned titles and had their weapons named and appear in records specifically as individuals within a culture that produces extraordinary individuals at an industrial rate, they came from somewhere else. They came from the Cataphractii that contained the Red Butchers between deployments. The Tartaros that let a warrior move like the armor wasn't there. The artifice suits of a bodyguard formation that had formally dissolved every identity inside them. The black plate that announced the Justaerin before they demonstrated anything. The Saturnine pattern born in exile, deployed by the First Legion's most absolute formation, angular and distinct in ways that reflect exactly how it was made. The suit of a Shadelord whose Techmarines solved the problem of fitting armor to a warrior that no standard frame was designed for, and left a record that says, Tactical Dreadnought Pattern, heavily modified, and nothing else. Tyberos is still active in the 41st millennium, still Shadelord of the Carcharodons Astra, somewhere in the outer dark, aboard warships with Heresy-era dreadnoughts in their holds, and a cultural identity old enough that its origin can only be theorized. His armor remains what it has always been, Tactical Dreadnought Pattern, modified, extent unspecified in any recoverable Imperial record. The brass bonding studs are still there. Hunger and Slake are still there, still not quite lightning claws, still 3 weapons worth of destruction per hand, still naming themselves after appetites. The title Red Wake refers to the trail left behind when he has moved through something at a speed that makes the movement difficult to track. The suit required power generation beyond what standard Terminator servos were designed to provide. He is still approximately 9 feet of corpse-white warrior moving too fast for the eye to follow, leading a chapter that arrived at the Badab War without warning and made Space Marines on both sides of a civil war register alarm. The armor pattern question won't resolve unless the Adeptus Mechanicus dispatches a delegation to the Carcharodons Astra with the specific brief of obtaining a complete pattern identification for the Shade Lord's suit. The Adeptus Mechanicus has documented opinions about virtually everything with moving parts, and is generally not reluctant to express them. The absence of a formal answer here is informative about what kind of request the formal answer would require initiating, and to whom it would need to be directed. Submitting a pattern identification inquiry to a warrior who moves too fast to track in close combat, whose face is described as a corpse-white nightmare, who commands a chapter that produces alarm in Imperial forces before anyone has determined whether they are hostile. Some bureaucratic gaps represent entirely rational institutional decisions. The Butcher's Nails produced warriors whose cataphracti armor served as their second cage. The Death Shroud built their legend from the systematic dismantlement of everything that would have made them individuals rather than a perimeter. The Justaerin announced their excellence in black plate before they had to demonstrate it, and then demonstrated it at the center of the Heresy's pivotal engagements. Sevatar led the Night Lord's Terminator elite, described exactly what he was doing without apology, and challenged his Primarch's reasoning directly in a legion where that wasn't the standard protocol, and survived long enough to accumulate a legend doing it. The Tartaros let warriors run in Terminator armor, which is a sentence that shouldn't work, but does. The Saturnine came from a moon of Saturn, looked like it had been designed in isolation, because it had been, and got assigned to the most extreme formation the Dark Angels maintained for the most demanding work they did. The Naufragia wore it. The Huskarls built something called a Solarite power gauntlet and got overlooked anyway. In every case that produced an actual legend, every formation that earned a name, every warrior whose title survived the engagements that should have ended him, the fear was never the armor. The armor was the prerequisite. The suit was the stage. The engineering made sure there was something for the fear to be afraid of, and then it got out of the way. Tyberos the Red Wake. Pattern unclassified. Location: the Outer Dark. Operational status: unbothered, armored, and purging. Subscribe for more stories from the deep end of the 40K canon